Testing, testing.
This is microphone number 5. This is microphone number 5. Okay. Is there something else we need to test? Oh, that's just me. right. Go ahead, say something.
Good morning, sir.
I will turn you up when I get back there. This you can put wherever is comfortable. If you got a breast
Right
pocket,
in here, yeah.
I'll get your microphone.
I suppose I should not repeat your death threat now that I'm mic'd. Okay, I will, when I start talking about the consequences.
So it's so quiet. Welcome to a fabulous Minnesota spring morning, which makes it so perfect to be here, right? In this warm and wonderful sanctuary with all these great people. So, morning has broken. Oh, thank you, yes. Well, and we had resolved to actually turn the monitoring over to you. So if you can't hear, please raise your hand, because there's nothing worse. And there's nothing worse about hearing about it afterwards. So, so anyway, I'm Ann Lewis, and I am so thrilled to welcome you back. I don't know how many people even remember Paul Harvey, but I always loved when he said page 2. So this is page 2. A restart, and welcome to people back, and welcome to people who are just coming for page 2. So we have that really amazing piece of our time that says we have a sanctuary here, and we have an extended sanctuary all over the world. Let's think big. So we're here for a really important reason. And it is reflected in the whole idea of this church and the Didier Seminar. And that is a commitment to listen for the Spirit in our own time and circumstances, as our forebears did in the past. We carry forth what they've brought to us, and we add to what we find relevant in our own time. And we all know that our own time has a lot of demands on us to listen very hard. So I think the also exciting thing is to think about, how does the Spirit speak? And where does it speak? And think then of the word ubiquitous, which I was just discussing with my grandson. That exciting thing about the Spirit is that it is ubiquitous. And in our thought leaders, whom we are so privileged to have with us, and in you, because this is a think along. We are doing this together. So the format of the morning is that I will now turn this over to our great interim minister, Scott Kennefick, who will do the Wikipedia introduction for Paul Raushenbush. And then we will turn that over to our other committee member, Phil Bullitt. No. Scott will introduce Paul Anderson, whom we all know and love, and who will bring a very interesting historical piece to us, and then he will give his presentation, ask some questions, and then we will have a break. We can process, we can do what we need to do during a break, get a little more coffee, muffins, and come back for, we could say page 3, for our professor from Macalester, who will bring us a different, deeper dimension, or another dimension of the psychology involved in difference, and why it matters and how we deal with it. And then we will have Paul Raushenbush come back and do an important piece of little small group. But don't panic, it's very low threat, of giving you a chance to do your own processing, talk amongst yourselves, and get some feedback from that, and then have a closing. And then, right on your phones, tomorrow, Sunday, big deal. Okay, so here we go.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Good to see all of you back, and welcome to those of you who are just joining us today, and welcome to those of you who are joining us on live stream as well. Just a reminder where the restrooms are, out this door and out this door. And I will briefly reintroduce you to our weekend speaker, Paul Brandeis Raushenbush. He currently serves as president and CEO of Interfaith Alliance, and formerly served as senior advisor for public affairs and innovation at Interfaith America, formerly the Interfaith Youth Corps. He was senior vice president and editor of Voices at Auburn Seminary from 2009 to 2015. He was the 2015, he was the executive editor of Global Spirituality and Religion for Huffington Post's Religion section, formerly served as the editor of BeliefNet. And then this is the last piece I'll share with you. From 2003 to 2011, he served as Associate Dean of Religious Life and the Chapel at Princeton University. Paul, welcome back. I hope you had a good night's rest.
Well, thank you very much. It is a real pleasure to be here. I grew up in a house where we would talk about the justice, and everybody, we never addressed our great-grandfather by name, but Supreme Court justices and professors were the highest, that was the pinnacle. So today to hear from a Supreme Court justice and a professor is like, I hear my parents saying, sit up straight. So I'm going to be listening carefully. I was asked to give just a little bit of a very brief recap of what we talked about last night, the think-along, and that's going to be part of I can't get rid of it. It's like think-along, everything's think-along. But last night the important message is that we have a struggle that has been a struggle throughout our nation's history about what our identity is, specifically around religion, around race, and who is a true American, and who is here by the indulgence of others. And what I tried to convey last night was that the founders of our country, and with all the imperfections of both religious leaders and judicial branch, we have to claim the narrative, we have to proclaim for America this is a country for all people, all religious traditions, and those who adhere to no religious tradition to live equally with dignity and respect. There are people who are arguing on all sides. This is a tension. It is a political tension. It is a struggle. And the other thing that I wanted to convey is that the stakes are high. This is not, there is a very animated group right now, motivated by fear that they are losing their grip on what they perceive as their country. And what the invitation is for us right now is to stand up, show up, be present at all of our civic spaces, including the ballot box, and insist that we want a country where people from all different backgrounds are treated equally and with respect, and that religious people, and I will say it, even Christian people, have a special responsibility to say, we do not adhere to the idea that we are the top of a hierarchy and then other people go down and are accepted. Rather, that we want to be part of a circle of faith that come together and live into the American promise of liberty and justice for all. So that's my brief, trying to recap what I was trying to say last night, and then I just want to say that now to have two such esteemed people speaking. This is not an introduction. Some others are doing that, but from the legal perspective, which it's very dangerous when I start to edge into the law, just because I have my father was also a law professor. Two of my siblings are lawyers, and of course I had a great grandfather who was on the Supreme Court. So I think there's still a little part of me that's like, oh, I can talk about that. No, I can't. Not really. We have someone who can really talk about that, which I'm very grateful for. And another part of this is, I'm excited to hear from a professor from my alma mater, looking inward, and not assuming that we can just point the finger outward. It's actually an opportunity to look at ourselves and how we process information and difference. And so I think this morning is going to be very rich. I'm going to sit down, and then we'll all have a chance to kind of think through this together later. So I'll invite the first introduction now.
So it's my privilege to get to introduce the other Paul on the docket, who's sitting back to my left. Many of you from House of Hope know Paul and his wife Jan, who are members of the congregation. And again, I'm reading from Wikipedia, so there's no guarantee that this is actually accurate. Paul Anderson is an American attorney and jurist who served as an Associate Justice of the Minnesota Supreme Court. He served as Chief Judge of the Minnesota Court of Appeals from 92 to 94. He was born in Eden Prairie, Minnesota. He earned a Bachelor of Arts degree from Macalester College and a Juris Doctorate from the University of Minnesota Law School. Governor Carlson appointed him to the Minnesota Court of Appeals as Chief Judge beginning on September 1st, 1992. 2 years later, Carlson appointed Anderson, I'm speaking of you in the third person, to be an Associate Justice of the Minnesota Supreme Court beginning on July 1st, 1994. He's the author of many important decisions, including a leading case on bail, State of Minnesota versus Wesley Brooks. He retired on May 31st, 2013, when he reached the statutorily mandatory retirement age for judges in Minnesota. What a concept. Maybe you can speak to that too. I don't know.
I will.
Right. Paul, welcome.
Okay. Now, one of the key things this morning is, can people hear me? See, I have a speech that's about 2 hours long, and I got to compress it into 55 minutes. And so I have a real danger of speaking real fast, like that. No, I'll try to be good, okay? A couple of things. Retirement at age 70, it's not that bad a thing. I could argue for 72. I probably wouldn't argue for 75. There are other people who can take over and deal with what you're doing, and so I had a good run. Missed it, of course, but no, it's not a big deal. That Wikipedia introduction misses something. I'm a farm kid. I grew up milking cows. My tractor color is green. cows are black and white. No, it's true. I mean, and my sister's out there. She knows that this is part of who we are. The thing is that, okay, I was panicked that maybe Anne took my notes. She didn't. But I got to confess to you is that people who sit on high courts, our court, are human beings. And they are a combination of all different factors. Some are better than others, some flawed. And we got to understand that. There's no God-given wisdom that comes down, is invested in somebody just because they sit on the court. Now, there are judges who think that happened. But then I keep reminding myself how I got onto the court, and I don't have time to tell you, but I'm an accident, all right? That's just the way it is. But the other thing I want to say before I get into what I'm going to say, I'm pretty intimidated what I'm going to talk to you about today. Those who know me is that, I give a lot of speeches. You can press a button and I'll give you a speech on this or that, 15, 20, 30, whatever. Today's topic is what I'm struggling with because it goes into the realm of theology, a bit of history. I like history, but I'm intimidated by it. And so I apologize that ahead of time because you'll see as I go through it, I have struggled a bit to make sure that this is relevant. But as I start, I want to read you something. I'm talking about the First Amendment. You know why we have the amendments to the Constitution? There are founders like James Mason who did not think that the Constitution got the job done. They actually wouldn't sign the Constitution because there were not sufficient guarantees of liberty in that Constitution. Those who signed it said, well, they're there. They're understood. If not explicit, they're implied. And many others of our founders said, no, let's make them explicit. So in, I think it was 1791, they came forward. They had something like 15, 16 amendments they wanted, and they came down to the 10 we have. But it's interesting that the first one, the one we're talking about, is about that amendment that says, Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the true exercise thereof. It goes on to talk about, the first thing in those amendments is freedom of religion and government will not establish. And now, why has it become so important? I'm going to read you something else. More than a constitutional guarantee against government interference with the freedom of speech and the press, or a guarantee of the separation of church and state, the First Amendment is also one of the nation's foremost normative and cultural symbols. Think about that. The First Amendment is one of the primary and foremost normative and cultural symbols of who we are as a people. That is why it is so important that we respect it and honor it, and why it's an issue that we have to deal with today. Now, before I get on, I'm going to talk about how is that we have this threat of Christian nationalism, and I'm going to explain how it kind of intersects with history, the law, and the court. A very complex issue, as I told you, and I've struggled with it. And it's been on the agenda since our country was founded, because the role of religion, and particularly Christian religion, has been a part of a long stay. Okay. Timothy Snyder has done a wonderful series on the history of the bloodlands. That's that area in Eastern Europe. It extends down from the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, all the way down to Ukraine. It is a horrible history. So many people have died there. And he's talking about Ukraine. For a long time it was called the Ukraine because it wasn't deemed to be a separate nation. We now call it the Ukraine. And he talks about when nations are formed, And once they're formed, they mold history to support who they are. And we need to understand that in the United States, we are molding. I mean, from the time you're a first grader, we indoctrinate you and mold you and tell you the history that in many ways is not true. It's a mythology. And it's drummed into us time after time after time. And, we don't have that great of history in some ways. I mean, if you were in Massachusetts and you did not adhere to exactly what Cotton Mather and the others wanted you to believe, you were ostracized. We talk about Roger Williams forming the colony of Rhode Island. You know why that was? They kicked him out of Massachusetts because he couldn't adhere to what the doctrine was. Sarah Hutchinson, I got to make sure I get the name. She was kicked out of Massachusetts, went down to Long Island, New York, where she and her family were killed by the Native Americans. The big difference was that she had a disagreement whether you could get to heaven by grace or good works. That was a big issue back then. We have had a lot of conflict in our history with respect to religion. And it's been a tug and pull, ebb and flow. And we need to understand that. We need to understand our history. Now, as I said, it ebbs and flows. Christian nationalism is an oxymoron. There's nothing Christian about this nationalist movement, but it's flourished over time. And it ebbs and flows, as Paul says, it flourishes in times of anxiety, insecurity, and angst. And we're in this time. Come on, folks. We live in the most free country in the world. We get to do what we want. I mean, Paul talked about his ancestors coming here and being just astounded with the freedom that they could experience in this country. Our country is great. We don't need to make it great again. We got to be careful that we don't let those who, have this nostalgic view of what we used to be, a mythology, of course, destroy what we have. No. We are a great country, and we need to appreciate it. And so we have to deal with, okay, I'm a 79-year-old white male. I have had all the privileges of white, gifts all my life. I mean, come on, I'm 6 feet, I'm white, I grew up in a stable, middle-class family. I mean, America spread itself out for me. I talk about my colleague Alan Page on the court, and I say that the two of us, we were born on the same table in the United States, but I was born in the middle. I had to really mess up if I was going to fall off. Alan, on the other hand, was pretty close to the edge. African American, in Canton, Ohio, had a good family, but he could have fallen off the edge or something. And so when I was talking about Ketanji Jackson coming to the court, I said that I hope she can bring the same thing to the United States Supreme Court that Alan Page brought to our court, because he grew up in a different America. He had different experiences than I had. And that's what we need to understand about this country, America, that we live in. It is very diverse, and there are many different aspects to who you are. Now, there's certain things. God, I'm so intimidated by this speech. I mean, Jan will verify that but there are a couple of things that I want, not a couple, 7 or 8 that I want to leave you with. Christian nationalism is real. It's all around us. If you start looking for it, you see it everywhere. And it's growing in its influence. And people who we regard as good people, really good people who are friends, neighbors, and relatives, they're part of it. They are. We need to understand that. But we need to understand that it's not a Christian movement. It is an imposter. It really is. It really is the summation of a political agenda clothed in the cloak of Christianity. And we need to understand it. If you go after Christian nationalism, you're not attacking Christianity. You're attacking the hypocrisy of those who kind of cloak it in that. Right? And we need to know it's a narrow, nationalistic, politically driven movement. Paul talked about this. He gave us some statistics. You know, by far the majority of the American people do not buy into this doctrine. But that makes it worse because they know that. They know they're going to lose. And they are so fearful. They are so fearful because they want the myth that they believe in to survive. And they'll do many different things to provide it. And so, another thing is that Paul talked about being involved. We've got to remember that movements like this thrive when people are silent. These are difficult times in our country, and we cannot remain on the sidelines. We need to really get involved because it is a threat to American democracy, and we really need to fully understand it. Now, I'm going to have to skip over. You know, Paul, I was going to pay such homage to your great-grandfather. He was really a great justice. You know, he was the first nominee to the United States Supreme Court that they had to have a Senate hearing on. He was Jewish. He was radical. He didn't like monopolies. He was known as the people's lawyer, the Robin Hood of the law. William Howard Taft, the ABA presidents, Eli Root, secretary, they opposed his appointment. Yet, he was one of our best. I like to compare him to James McReynolds. The vote on Brandeis was 47-22, strong opposition. McReynolds was 44-6. You know I don't like Clarence Thomas. I've had dinner with Clarence Thomas. I've sat next to Ginny Thomas. And it's on one level they're very congenial. No, they are not good people. Okay, and I won't do this. I was thinking of bringing a friend of mine. Went to school with him and played basketball with him, and they described what it was like to play basketball with Clarence Thomas. He cut corners and cheated back then too. But McReynolds could even be worse than Clarence Thomas. And so I bring that up because, we've been here before, and we can survive as a nation if we do what Paul says we show up. Now, what is Christian nationalism? Its tendencies are rooted in Christian separatism and the promotion of a United States that is explicitly white Christian nation. They believe that we're meant to be a Christian nation, whatever that means, and they want to take back the United States for their vision of the Christian God. Now, I don't know who she is. One of the reasons I'm Presbyterian, is because they accept somebody like me, Yes, this is true. I consider myself spiritual, but I'm not necessarily as dogmatic a Christian as others. But is that we all come to our vision of God in different ways. We have multiple visions of God in this room, and that's a good thing, and we should be able to do that. But Christian nationalism don't want that to happen. They believe that America is a body made up of heterosexual, white, native-born, English-speaking, and thirdly, patriarchal people. Women, you've got to be aware of that. Christian nationalism is a threat because they believe in, Janet will give me. Amy Coney Bryant is a member of the People of God. She was a handmaiden of that cultist organization. They believe in male dominance and superiority. She sits on the Supreme Court, but she belongs and believes in that approach. Let's hope that she can see the change. And so what's happened over time is that right-wing politicians have taken over this concept of genuine people who believe in the Christian faith and distorted it to their own purposes. And, you know, they believe, as the United States was, we were a people chosen by God. I used to ask my mother, I said, you know, if Christianity is so good, how could God abandon so many people in China and not get the word to them about Jesus? You know, I mean, it's still an issue, and you know, it's kind of decided. So, and I was talking earlier about Professor Timothy Snyder. If you're interested in understanding what's going on in Eastern Europe, what I call the Bloodlands, and so many deaths occurred, he has got he's a professor at Yale, 24 series of lectures on how Ukraine came to be in the Bloodlands. But one of the things that he said early on, because we are in the midst of creating the country of Ukraine. It is becoming a country as a result of this war. But he said, be careful, we've got to be aware that when a country gets formed, it looks at history and co-opts history to support its own vision and ideals. That's what's happened in the United States. It will happen in Ukraine. And we need to be aware of this mythology because it's a bad, bad history. It is a mythological vision who we are. Now, virtually all our founders were not Orthodox or evangelical Christians. Scary thought. Some were atheists. Jefferson was a deist. There were Unitarians. There were several types of Protestants and many other. I take pride, though, that we Scots Presbyterian had a big influence when our country was founded. You take a look at the structure of the Presbyterian Church, and you see that there's kind of a symmetry with the way we built our country. I mean, but we were diverse. Jefferson, as I said, is deist. He had his own Bible. I tried to find it. My aunt gave it to me when I was a teenager, and I love it. It's called the Jefferson Bible. He took the Bible and pulled from it the things that he thought were irrelevant and that Jesus might have said. He did not believe in Jesus as a deity, but he accepted Jesus as a great prophet, maybe one of our greatest prophets, and believed what he said should be followed. The Constitution does not mention God. Now, okay, we're going to back up. People say, Paul, the Declaration of Independence does. It does. You know why it's in the Declaration of Independence? We were getting rid of George III, and we had to appeal to a higher authority, and we had to put that someplace. And we're saying that, no, God is who directs us, not George. That's why it's in the Declaration of Independence, but it's not in the Constitution. And we remember, and also remember that our founders were the product of the end of the Age of Enlightenment and the Renaissance. Free thinking of men, the primacy of reason, and understand this, they were very aware of the bloody wars in Europe that were centered around religion. So when they designed this country, they eventually said, we're going to put a prophylactic on that. We're going to allow people to freely exercise religion, and we will not establish religion because we do not want that kind of bloodshed and turmoil here in the United States. So, I mean, it's a pretty strong statement by our founders that we are not a Christian nation. Now, okay, Paul mentioned the Treaty of Tripoli. I like that because I actually have stood on the shores of Tripoli. Not the actual shores that our Marines landed on because they filled in the bay, but right in front of the castle, okay? I was there dealing with elections and freedom, okay? And I've thought about that, is that The United States went there to protect our sailors from the pirates. But in that document, it said that we are not a Christian nation. Now, a lot of hypocrisy with Scalia on originalism. But if you want to be an originalist, I'd go to the Treaty of Tripoli and say, what did our founders say? We're not a Christian religion. And so when we were formed, Christianity was not a big part of who we are. But there are ebbs and flows, as I say. And in the early 19th century, particularly into the 20s, we had a period that was called the Great Awakening. And this is where you see some of the first tenets of the evangelical movement. I think that, and I believe that my ancestors were part of that, but it's an interesting thing about that time. We talk about millennials. Don't get confused with this current generation we're dealing with. Is that when you're talking about evangelical history, you need to talk about post-millennial and pre-millennial thinking. And early evangelical movements in the United States were post-millennial. And that was based on the belief that the second coming will come when there's peace on earth, and it'll come sooner if we make earth a nice place to be. So the post-millennial and early evangelicals were very optimistic, and they were working to have a better and more peaceful world. They were for good treatment for the mentally ill. They had a better view than most towards women. They wanted the better, and very strongly they opposed slavery. They were an optimistic group. So I kind of like that history. I like to think that, well, my ancestors bought into that. But we now have the Civil War. That was a horrible, almost 750,000 people died. It was horrible. And it was hard to be optimistic in the light of such devastation. And then you had the other thing coming from, out here on the left. I could say the right, but most people would say, you had science coming, and you had discovery. Oh my God, Charles Darwin. Oh, his theory utterly destroyed a literal interpretation of the Bible. Think how devastating that had to be for people. I mean, beliefs are something strong. And for someone like this to come along and say, well, what the Bible says is not true. And so you had this schism in religion during this time. We Presbyterians of the North, we got to make that distinction. We bought into a religious progressive point of view. And we sought to find common ground between the Christian faith, the new science, and criticism of literal interpretation of the Bible. We sought a way to combine what we are learning with our religion, okay? And we moved away from the literal or the miraculous, looked more towards a more sound social agenda. I like to say, but my people and me said, I believe in the Bible. That's why I don't take it literally. Think about that. You can believe in the Bible, but you need to understand what type of document it is and how it comes across. Well, conservatives had none of that. They rebelled and stuck to their orthodoxy. And they wrote a number of treatises called the Fundamentals. And this will be important as I go on here, as I make a distinction. I do not condemn evangelicals. We are an evangelical church. We can be proud of that. But we're different from the fundamentalists. And so when I talk about the insidious part of what's in our society, when I say the fundamentalists, I'm not terribly fond of them. Evangelicals had come in many different forms, and many are good people who I can identify with. But it's important that it came out of that era. But they were kind of weird in a way. Not weird in the sense that my niece referred to me as being her cool uncle. No, weird in that people thought that they were out of touch with reality. And so they tended to draw into themselves and to focus on preparing themselves and their close friends for the ultimate second coming. They were not reaching out to improve better society. The Scopes trial, 1925 in Tennessee, was a good metaphor for that. And William Jennings Bryan versus Clarence Darrow. I'll get to the comparison of the two of them. But that put the views of the fundamentals on display and held them up to derision and well, basically said, do you really believe in this? Now, William Jennings Bryan won that trial, but the fundamentalists lost the public battle for public opinion. And they tended to say, okay, there's nothing that's going to be good for us if we get out in this public sphere, and so we're going to withdraw into ourselves. H.L. Mencken described, I don't like Mencken, but he was clever with words. And he described what happened in the Scopes trial, and when he was dismissing William Jennings Bryan. He said he's a tin pot pope in the Coca-Cola belt, and a brother to the forlorn pastors who belabor half-wits in galvanized iron tabernacles behind railroad yards. That was the view of fundamentals that's coming out of that time. Now, it's ironic that Byron, who died shortly after the trial, was a peace activist, former Secretary of State, had many political views that led to New Deal reforms. H.L. Mencken, on the other hand, clever as he was a racist, anti-Semite, and believed in eugenics. So let's make sure that we understand history and not, let's understand who Mencken was and understand who Bryan was. Now, as they move forward, the evangelicals, in particular, kind of withdraw into themselves. You had a collateral group that was there on the scene in the 20s. Do you know that in the 20s, there were over 50 KKK clubs in Minnesota? Yes, the KKK was dominant. And Paul mentioned it in other ways that, how they were in Washington, D.C. I mean, these are pictures, you can't see it. That's a gathering in Fargo-Moorhead. This was what we're doing. So there's a collateral group for which the Christian nationalists drew much of their support from. But they still withdrew until. Oh, Richard Nixon is such a complex figure. He really is. And I mean, we were down at the Hoover Library, and Hoover said, I've met Nixon. He wasn't very fond of him. Minnesotan Harold Stassen was he was insightful. He urged Eisenhower to replace Nixon in '56, but it didn't work. Anybody thinking of wanting to replace Kamala Harris should go back to '56 and see what happens to somebody. You got to be very careful, If you're going to take on the lion, you better kill the lion. And he took on Nixon, and he was unable to prevail. But Nixon found symbiosity with Christian nationalists, Christian fundamentalists. And he used them, and he used the silent majority. And I'm going to tell you a little factoid here. Do you know why? The Roe versus Wade decision was released on January 23rd, 1973. You know why that is? Nixon campaigned on an anti-abortion platform. Warren Burger knew that. And so he held up Roe versus Wade until after January 20th, when Nixon was sworn in, and only released the opinion after. Now, Harry Blackmun thought, that's all right, good time to release it, State legislatures are in session, they'll just move forward very quickly and adopt what we said in Roe versus Wade. Well, that's not the way it happened. Not by a long shot. So what happened then is we came to a period of time where Christian nationalism, this thinking, was a bit more robust. I can remember, okay, full disclosure. Everybody who doesn't know anything, God, he's a left-wing liberal Democrat. He sounds like it. Hey, I was at a session with, it was Dave Durnberg's funeral, and former Chief Justice Magnuson was there, Tim Pawlenty was there. Eric was a good Chief Justice, and I complimented him. I said, but, Eric, you're a little too conservative for my mind. Pawlenty says, yeah, Paul, but 99% of the people are more conservative than you. No, that's not true. It's not true, okay? But that's the vision. We get categorized. But I was really forced out of the Republican Party and had no place, no home. And then we had an accidental governor who I knew and liked and supported. And, well, I won't go there, but I'll just really look back. I am truly an accident. I am really an accident. And it's just something that I just have to acknowledge. Now, as they were on the scene, the Christian nationalists became more powerful. They started under Reagan. I think Reagan might even be surprised of where they are right now. I don't think he bought into that. But it's like if you unleash the tiger, be careful. Because Charles Colson, and others unleashed this tiger that has led us to the situation where we are now. Okay, my wife is, I still got a little more time, I'm all right. And so, now I guess I want, if you could put up a PowerPoint. Those are our founders. Oh my God. Are they a bunch of heretics? Oh! I got to search hard to find somebody who believes in the same God that most of us do. No, that's how they formed the country. So now, move to the next one. We got a series of slides here. There she is, Sarah Palin. Hey, that's her, right here in River City, right down the street at the XL Center. I remember walking down there. What a scary situation. I mean, one, I could see out of my chamber's window the front of the Capitol. There were a mass group of probably 50 mounted policemen on horses. The streets were blocked. I mean, this was not the country that I believed in. And so I went down and I kind of wanted to absorb the atmosphere. And boy, it was scary. And then I wanted to go back to my chambers in the courthouse. I was blocked most ways. You can't go down that street. I mean, a voice out of nowhere said, stop, stop. I didn't know it was me. I mean, I was starting to get an experience of what it is like to live in a Christian nationalist police state. And it was scary. And then she gave her speech. Oh, she's good though. She made every middle-aged or older white male fall in love with her. She would wink at us. She would smile at us. I mean, she would just draw us into her web. That's how it's done, But it was started then. Let's go to the next one. And it culminated in this. What a sad event in our history. The siege of the Capitol. You can show some more pictures. There. That's the symbol of Christianity. A person who is invading the pinnacle of a symbol of our democratic society is bringing a cross and praying the guidance of God to protect him as he goes in. Another one. Next one, Jan. See that guy? He's holding up the Holy Bible. He's saying that he's there because of the divine guidance of God. This is what this movement is about. Let's show another one and see. Okay, we'll leave this one up for a while. Is that, okay, do you know what an absolute privilege it is to be appointed to a high court? Oh my God, what a responsibility and what an obligation you have to do well, and to do right. You want to do justice, but you want to do the right thing. And for me to have served in that position and have to deal with what those people have brought us is something terrible. And they are the direct result of Christian nationalism. I'm sure that Mitch McConnell would not say that he openly identifies as a Christian nationalist, but he promoted their agenda. See, he was a young senator when Robert Bork came before the Senate for confirmation, and he was turned down. Mitch McConnell was very offended by that. And then you had Mitch Bork maybe shouldn't have been on the court, but before that you had a guy named Clement Hainsworth out of South Carolina who was a very good jurist and deserved to be on the court, but was rejected because he was from the South. And Mitch McConnell studied that history and said, never again, never again. I'm going to change the court. And he did. We were in Valparaiso, Chile, when we heard that Scalia died on February 13, in the last year of Obama's presidency. Oh, by the way, he was on a funded private hunting tour with a friend in Texas, like so many of the Supreme Court. He was taking the quote-unquote perks of the job. McConnell would not give Merrick Garland a hearing. They didn't turn down Merrick Garland. They wouldn't give him a hearing because his credentials were so good that they didn't want to risk that. So they just shut it down, okay? They came up with this false Biden rule. It's not a Biden rule at all. And I've written an article on it and I've debunked it. But it was a hypocrisy that he promoted. And that's how we got this guy in the back row there, right here, Gorsuch. He is probably as close to being a troglodyte conservative as Alito is, okay? I mean, I separate Justice. He's in Clarence Thomas, he's in a class of his own. But Gorsuch and Alito are dangerous. They're smart and they're clever. Alito is a Chief Justice wannabe, and he's given up on that, but he's going to exercise as much power as that. It's interesting. You see how the dynamic in the latest abortion prevention bill, Clarence Thomas and Alito dissented to that order. There's an article this morning. Oh, this is how sad things are. The writer was saying is that with respect to this most recent Supreme Court decision, he said, that's as good as you're going to get out of this court. Think about that. That's as good as we're going to get. I mean, well, anyway. So that's how we got Gorsuch. But, the new president is going to be elected. That new president should be given the opportunity to choose the justice. So, okay, you buy into that. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, unfortunately, dies at the end of September. Again, the last year of the term of Trump, okay? So what does Mitch McConnell do? He gives her an immediate hearing. And by the time you get to the first week of November, she is confirmed. That is the rankest hypocrisy. And there's going to be a cartoon I put up later that'll show you. I mean, these folks are hypocrites. And we got to realize that. Now, what should we look for as we look for leaders? running out of time. I still got a little bit more. Hey, I can go on as long as I want because I got the podium, right? Is that as a democratic country, we have certain ideals and we have virtues. And I suggest you go up sometime to the Minnesota State Capitol. As you go up the steps, you look up there, 6 statues. Now below it, there's the Roman god Nike, who is holding out a laurel wreath. And who is Nike going to anoint? The very person that your great-grandfather said is the most important person in American society, the average citizen. Nike is crowning us as the victor because we are the victors in that we are sovereign in this country. And that's very important to remember when you think about what your obligations are as citizens. You are the most important person in this society because our founders gave you the sovereign power to govern. Now above that are the 6 virtues: wisdom, courage, prosperity, truth, integrity, and prudence. There are many other virtues listed, over history, but those were what Cass Gilbert, working with Daniel Chester French. French was the sculptor who did Abraham Lincoln in the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., so we're pretty privileged to have 6 of his works there on the front of our Capitol. And so what you need to do is be very, very careful in your analysis of who you vote for and look for these virtues. Now, last night, Katrina asked a question. Katrina, I got to get to it. It was difficult to answer. It's telling about people who, we are a 2-party system, and you got a choice between one or the other. I have an answer for her. Well, it's not mine. It's George Will. George Will, the conservative columnist? He gave us all the answer. Because he is not enthralled by this whole conservative movement, Christian nationalist movement. He says, so what do we do as citizens? He said, remain Republican if you want. That's your heritage. Right? But in the short term, vote them out of office because they are bad. And if you get rid of them out of office, then you can bring in a new wave that is more responsible. So that's what I would say to Katrina. I said, tell your friends, vote for a Democrat, at least in the short term. A good Democrat, someone with, it's not always, it's not, some people would say it's an oxymoron. It isn't, but there are some, but vote for those who stand for what we believe in as a country. I know how difficult it is. I used to be a Republican. I'm a Lincoln, Stassen, Eisenhower Republican. I cherish what my party, but quite frankly, folks, I'm a Democrat now because I'm too old to wait for the Republicans to reform themselves. And if I vote for some Democrats, maybe we'll get some responsible Republicans who oppose them. It's difficult. I mean, I had this discussion with Dave Durenberger and other Republicans who I grew up with. Dave had a very difficult time identifying as a Democrat. He never did. Of course, the last 2 decades he voted as a Democrat. He just didn't identify for that. Arnie Carlson, Arnie's a Democrat. I mean, he's pretty outspoken on that. But my point is to what we can do is we got to get rid of this toxic element in our society. And we don't get rid of it if we support them. Paul said that. I'm not alone in saying that. You're a pretty reasonable, scholarly, educated man. Do you agree with me? Well, anyway, I don't want to put you on the spot. But there are things that we can do. And that's one of the things. Okay. Somebody asked me, are you going to address the behavior of the current Supreme Court. Some of you who read the Minneapolis paper see that I had a letter to the editor telling Clarence Thomas, I said, follow the rule of holes. Once you've dug yourself into a legal, ethical, misbehavior hole, stop digging. And I don't know if he's capable of stopping digging. A year ago, I gave a speech to the AUW, St. Paul, another one, and they asked me, said, what can you do? Speak out. I felt at that time like I was a whisper in the wind. But yet, look what's happened a year later. More and more is coming out about Clarence Thomas. We got to keep speaking out. By the way, folks, I've been around long enough. Stay tuned. There's more coming. And they're going to find out there's more with respect to the other justices. I got about 5 minutes. Justice Roberts is a decent guy. Brad Johnson, he goes to this church. Maybe you don't know that. He roomed with Roberts when he was in prep school, okay? At that time of life, Brad's mother died. And he said you could not find a person who was more understanding and kind to another human being in this very difficult time of life. I have a law associate who was on a law review with him, and a friend Jim Blanchard, former governor of Michigan, ambassador to Canada, he says, he's a good guy, except that in some ways he isn't. But he's a good human being, and this is where we got to make judgments. I have a law school classmate who was arguing a case before the Supreme Court. This was before Roberts came on the court. And he got a call out of the blue from John Roberts. He said, you may want to talk to me. I've been before the Supreme Court any number of times, and I think I can give you some insights. This is the time. He's a good human being. Clarence Thomas is not. No. And Ginny Thomas is, she's something else. But this guy, I'm not optimistic that he's going to resign. I've had conversations with him, and they are of the view that we have survived the slings and arrows of those who want to destroy us, and they haven't, and we'll keep doing it because we are survivors. So maybe, just maybe, the pressure will get to the point that his colleagues would tell him, you are disparaging the reputation of the court. But I bring this up because the question is that what can we do? And it's easy to give up when we look at those people up there. I got to bring Amy Coney Barrett. She belongs to a group called the People of God, or the People of Praise. Small group. They have 3 schools in the country. One in Massachusetts, one outside of Notre Dame University, and then if you look at a school right next to the Vikings training facility, that's them. One of the 3 schools, okay? And this Jan, she can't help but repeat these things when she reads it. Did you know, she says, that Amy Coney Bryant was a handmaiden in the People of Praise? And then she went on to read what that meant. Ooh, scary. If any woman should be very scared that someone like that is on the court if you want to protect their rights, because she is indoctrinated. And then you got Kavanaugh. He didn't tell the truth. He really didn't. Now, Kavanaugh is not as bad ideologically as Gorsuch. I say with respect to Kavanaugh, he's persuadable, but not persuasive. He's not capable of bringing others along with him, but on certain issues you can get to him. But of those members on the court, Rehnquist lied. He's not there now. With respect to the memo he sent to Justice Jackson on Plessy versus Ferguson, supporting that doctrine. But you have Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, Barrett, to a degree. They fudged on what their position is on abortion. And then you got Clarence Thomas. God, I have gotten so strident in my old age. I believe Anita Hill. I believe Cassie Ford. They were telling the truth, but there was a strategy to defeat them. And Rehnquist is the one who started us down the road that says the wall of separation metaphor is not a statement of the original intent of the Constitution. He said that it is a contradiction, and it favors separation over accommodation. And what this court is into is accommodation. They're buying into the arguments that we describe as the preservation complex. The Christian nationalist says, we're about preserving our country the way it was intended to be. And they are into grievance politics. Oh, they are so... What does that mean, dear? You have to tell me what that means. I mean, is that the court is into these wholly irrelevant arguments. And but the thing you need to know is the court gets to pick and choose the cases that they get. And you got to watch carefully because they're picking and choosing. I mean, they get over 8,000 petitions each year. They accept about 80, and they're picking those that advance their agenda, which is kind of scary. Well, anyway, does that mean I should quit? I mean, a better sign, dear, would be this,
How about this?
So
Yeah.
I want to end on what Paul said. We are an optimistic people. We are the optimistic evangelists. We truly do believe that we can make the world better. Okay. And so we got to get about that task. As Paul says, start showing up. Because if you go back to, one more slide. There he is. This guy believes in precedent. This is the judge in northwestern Texas who ruled on the abortion pill. You need to understand that this guy believes in precedent. Really? Where does he find it? He lied. That's him before the Senate confirmation. He lied. He covered up an article where he wrote a very strident, we'd call it Christian nationalist article. And he told them, take my name off it. I don't want them to find out about it when I go for the hearing. And then he had appeared on 2 radio shows, Christian radio shows, where he was spewing forth this terrible anti-woman, racist rhetoric. And he said, wipe that out. So, what do I mean by following precedent? Thomas did the same thing, got away with it. Kavanaugh did the same thing, got away with it. To a degree, Barrett did away with it. So why can't I? We got to stop that. We cannot let it continue. And I'll quit there. I don't know, is that if there's time for questions? I love questions.
Couple of questions. Phil's got the microphone over here.
Okay. The thing about questions, okay, I told you how intimidated I was about this topic. I still am. But questions don't faze me. You know why? I control the answers. So you can ask anything you want. Phil.
I want to be so bold as to say one thing. And I think this is the most fantastic example of freedom of speech and honesty and the way things really can change and get done. And it's also precedent to me in this church and this seminar to be able to have this kind of a conversation. So I salute you, Paul, for your honesty and you're willing to share your very personal reflections.
Sounds like you're pandering, Ann.
It is not.
You know, I told her I was going to leave. I had to leave at 10 o'clock, and she said, if you try to leave here, I'm going to kill you. I'm actually living under a death threat from Ann Lewis. The reason I'm here is I'm going to digress here. I've had death threats. A bullet has been shot through our bedroom window, and is that I've been spat at. 450 anti-abortion people pray for my soul because I'm a baby killer. Now, my friend said, Paul, don't get upset about that. You need whatever help you can get. But, is that when you put yourself out there, folks, you will get some pushback. Yes, sir.
Paul, thank you very much. I enjoyed that. But I wasn't here last night. I had a conflict, so I may be repeating
He was good, by the way.
What was talking about.
I think it's online, right?
Yeah, no, I plan to watch it. But
I mean, you know what a pleasure it is
Paul,
to be in the
Paul,
aura of
Paul,
Strandis Brandeis.
Paul,
I know.
I have the floor right now. Okay. I know I can't carry your briefcase with these issues, but again, the freedom of speech and all that Ann commented, I think, is a good one. Yet, where I'm concerned is in our country, freedom of speech doesn't mean we have to know who's talking. And I think we should know who's talking in freedom of speech, whether it's corporations giving all this money or, all the things that, again, this court has ruled against.
Go back to the picture of the court.
The second piece.
Those people have said that corporations are people.
Yeah.
And that money is free speech.
But even in people, we still need to know who's talking.
Absolutely.
And there is such a thing as slander and libel that free speech does not give you permission. Anyway.
Were you disappointed with the Dominion settlement?
The other thing that Mayor was put in last night was the idea, the discussion has got to separate nationalism from patriotism. I'm convinced that the nationalists believe they are being patriots. America first, or America this, or only, like you say, white guys. That's nationalism. That's not patriotism. And I think that's in this discussion. But we as Christians, we can't be seduced by, we need to rule this country. We need to be part of the people that rule this country.
He's my straight man, by the way. Set it up because he's talking about the need for accountability and some of the mechanisms the court puts in place that shroud accountability. And the other key thing, and it's one of my points I didn't make, see, you can be a patriot. You can be a patriot. I like patriots. But just because somebody likes our country and loves our country, that doesn't make them a Christian nationalist. No. So be patriots. It's a good thing.
Right. Thank you. We'll take a 10-minute break, and if you want to continue this conversation over coffee and scones, please feel free to do so, and we'll reconvene here in 10 minutes.
Okay. You know, at my age, when I bend down to pick something up, you always ask yourself the question, is there anything else I should do while I'm down here?
Here, you're not going to get it. Oh, that's blank.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Without everyone hearing it.
That's true. I didn't realize that my groans and
Oh, my daughter talks about my dad noises.
and it's all good to go.
Hello again. Welcome back. As the weekend was developing subject-wise, we realized that we would be hearing from the political side of this issue, the cultural side of this issue, and we felt that we needed to offer you as well some reflection about who you are, who I am as individuals, and what we bring into this kind of discussion. So I go to my Wikipedia. Dr. Piercarlo Valdezsolo is a social psychologist studying how emotions influence thought and behavior. I've heard they do. We're fortunate to have him here today because he's visiting Macalester College this year from Claremont McKenna College in Los Angeles area, where he's associate professor, chair of the psychology department, and director of the Moral Emotions and Trust Lab. How valuable is that right now? His research studies questions like, what drives moral hypocrisy? How does awe influence attitudes toward religious belief? We want to bring him back to talk more about that. And for whom do we feel company and compassion, and why? His work has been featured in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Time Magazine, USA Today, on NPR's Talk of the Nation. He's a contributor to Scientific American, co-authored the book Out of Character, and has been named a rising star, wow, by the Association for Psychological Science. Piercarlo is married, has 3 children, and a complicated life, complicated by commuting between St. Paul and the coast. Please welcome Dr. Piercarlo Valdezsolo.
Well, thank you. Can everyone hear me? I tend to project, so I'm going to have to tone it down a little bit for my normal speaking voice. No, keep it up? Okay. So thank you all for having me. This is great. I, as a psychology professor, my normal audience are undergraduate or graduate students, but I really like moving beyond the kind of research university setting and speaking to community members. It's what I like best about my job. I find that if my ideas stay in a vacuum, then what good are they? So this is going to be completely different from what you've been listening to. I wasn't here last night, but just from what I've heard about the content of those talks, this will be a different ballgame. It'll give you a taste of what a college, almost like college lecture is like, what your children and grandchildren have to pay obscene amounts of money to experience. But I hope that it'll become clear how what I will discuss relates to what you've been thinking and hearing about the last couple of days. Okay, so title of my talk, The Psychology of Meaning, How We Create Meaning and Why We Struggle with Difference. So really what I want to do today is tell you or make 4 points. And each of these 4 points will lead to one broad conclusion about how I think we can best engage across differences and what are the sort of core psychological foundations of those differences. So the first point that I'm going to hopefully convince you of, and that maybe you don't need to be convinced of in the first place, believing that life is meaningful is a strong psychological need. This is something that motivates and animates really every human being. Second, that sense of meaning is wrapped up with our identity, who we think we are, our sense of self, who you would say you are if someone were to ask you about your life story. Third, your identity is fundamentally wrapped up with your social relationships. The people in your family, the people in the groups that you belong to and identify with. And then fourth, we protect our identities. We fiercely protect our identities, and therefore we protect our belief that our life is meaningful by defending those groups and relationships that are important to us. So, those are the 4 things. Again, this is going to build towards, I hope, one general conclusion about what motivates difference, what motivates us to find differences with others and to engage, hopefully more constructively, across those differences. We'll get to that. Okay, so we'll start with point number 1, the idea that believing that our lives are meaningful is a fundamental, strong psychological need. I'll tell you how psychologists who study meaning tend to define what it means to believe that you have meaning. There are 3 core features of believing that your life is meaningful. First, you have the sense that your life has some kind of purpose. It has a goal. You're not just sort of aimlessly milling about in a random and chaotic world. There's direction. You're goal-directed. Second, that goal is significant. It matters, not just to you, but to the world. You're not engaged in some kind of Sisyphean task of pushing a rock up a hill and then watching it fall down and then doing it again. You've got a purpose, and that purpose matters. And then third, and this is the one that's a little bit more jargony, I suppose, you have the sense that your life is coherent. It's predictable, it has order, and it makes sense to you. If someone were to ask you what your life is about, you could articulate what your life is about. All right, so researchers who study the sense that our lives are meaningful conclude that you're going to believe that your life has meaning if you believe it's got purpose, you believe it's got significance, and you believe it has coherence. Psychologists have been studying this for, I'd say, maybe 30 or 40 years, but philosophers have been studying it for a lot longer. And one of the first philosophers who started to address questions of meaning in more or less a psychological way was Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl has written a number of amazing books on the topic, and just how strong the motivation to find meaning is. The one that he's most well known for is called Man's Search for Meaning. And in it, Frankl lays out an argument for why feeling like your life has purpose, significance, and coherence is such a strong predictor of our well-being. When we lack this sense, we suffer psychologically. We feel lost, we feel anxious, we feel stressed, we feel as if the PowerPoint has decided to stop. Oh, okay. Okay. So this idea of just how important this motive to find meaning is nicely captured in this quote. Those who have a why to live can bear with almost any how. Right? This sense that you have meaning can help us endure really any features of our environment. And Frankl was talking from experience. He was a Holocaust survivor. He had a lot of his family who were killed by the Nazis, and he knew a thing or two about what it meant to experience trauma and to find ways to be resilient in the face of that trauma. And for him, it's really this sense of, again, purpose, significance, and coherence that allows you to maintain a sense of well-being. Okay, so very strong desire, motivation, finding meaning in our lives. I'm going to throw some bar graphs up here. Don't worry about the numbers. I will tell you what exactly is going on here. These are the kinds of measures that psychologists use to figure out how meaningful people believe their lives are. So they'll ask questions like, to what extent is it true that you understand your life's meaning? To what extent is it true that you're looking for something that makes your life feel meaningful? To what extent are you always looking to find your life's purpose? So psychologists ask participants to answer these questions, and when they do, they find that, on average, humans in the US, cross-culturally, will report that they find a lot of meaning in their lives. So on the left here, we've got some graphs that show how, on average, people tend to report the amount of meaning they feel in their lives. And on measures of a 1 to 7, on average, most groups of human beings will report levels of meaning somewhere in the 5s. That tends to be the most common response. So people are reporting a good amount of meaning in their lives. Great. This should mean, at least according to Frankl, people are doing pretty darn well. They feel this sense of purpose. They feel this sense of significance and coherence. They ought to be experiencing well-being. One very strange thing about meaning, though, that's also captured here, is that even when life feels meaningful, even when you tell others that you have a strong sense of meaning, you nonetheless will also tell people that you continue to search for meaning. So this is kind of weird, and this is a paradox in this research. Why is it the case that something we say we already have is something we also say we're continuing to search for? Why would humans be motivated to attain something they already believe they have? For all the other needs in our life, it doesn't really work that way. If I'm hungry and then I eat, well, that need goes away. I'm not hungry anymore. If I have a biological need for relationships, well, if I form them, then that need dissipates. Not the case for meaning. This is something that we will report having, but we also simultaneously report we're still looking for it. And the reason why researchers think this is the case is because this sense of meaning is very precarious. It feels very unstable. It feels like something we could lose if we're not careful. So that combination of something that we really feel we need and feeling like it could go away at any moment causes us psychologically to be really, really, really motivated to keep trying to attain it. Okay, so that's point number one. Believing that life is meaningful is a strong psychological need. We're focused on it. When we don't have it, we're freaked out. When we do have it, seems like things should be okay. Point number two, meaning is wrapped up with our identity. Our sense of life as having purpose, significance, and coherence depends on who we think we are. And not just who we think we are right now, but who we think we have been in the past and who we think we will be in the future. That idea of connecting who we are now with who we have been and who we will be is called narrative identity in psychology. This theory suggests that how we even begin to think about who we are involves telling a story that connects our past self to our present self to our future self. And when I say telling a story, I don't mean this metaphorically, I mean literally you construct a narrative, like a plot of a book, with a beginning and a middle and an end. And the better able you are to tell a coherent story about who you are, the more sense you can make of your life, the more meaning you can derive from it. So these stories about our lives that connect past to present to future, they help us answer this question that is directly related to the meaning of our lives, which is, what am I for? What am I doing here on earth? What is my purpose? Does my purpose matter? Does my purpose make sense to me? Here's a nice quote that I think captures this process of constructing a narrative identity. This comes from a book by Margaret Atwood called Alias Grace. When you are in the middle of a story, it isn't a story at all, but only a confusion, a dark roaring, a blindness, a wreckage of shattered glass and splintered wood. Like a house in a whirlwind, or else a boat crushed by the icebergs or swept over the rapids, and all aboard powerless to stop it. It's only afterwards that it becomes anything like a story at all, when you are telling it to yourself or to someone else. So this captures a really important, crucial feature of how we build stories of ourselves. We look at the moments in our lives, we remember them, and we start to try to put them together into some kind of coherent framework that makes sense to us and that is characterized by purpose, significance, growth, and coherence. When we're in a moment, when we're experiencing an event, we don't yet know how it's going to fit in to the story of our lives. It's only afterwards, upon reflection, that we start to put the pieces together. So our experiences of the world in any given moment is confusing. We don't know yet what it means. It's only upon reflection that we start to construct some kind of meaning from it. So these stories, this narrative identity, it is what brings coherence to your life. It's what allows you to make sense of the momentary experiences that we go through day to day. I'm going to show you a study that I think really, really captures just how important telling stories about who we are provides that sense of predictability and stability to ourselves. Even though the stories that we tell about who we are change significantly over time, right? The story of your life today is probably much different than it was 40 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, perhaps even 5 years ago. But at every moment in our lives, it feels like we know who we are. And it feels like we've got some kind of certainty that we're not going to significantly change in the years to come. So this is an idea called the end of history illusion, or a finding called the end of history illusion. Again, graph, I'll explain what's going on here. These researchers, they asked people starting at the age of 18 all the way up to 68, split by decades, so 18-year-olds, 28-year-olds, 38-year-olds, 48, 58, 68. They asked them, to what extent do you feel you have changed over the past 10 years as a person? To what extent are you a different person today than you were 10 years ago? And then they also asked them, to what extent do you think you will change over the course of the next 10 years? Now, what you see on this graph here is separate lines for how much people report having changed over the past 10 years, and how much they report anticipating they will continue to change over the past 10 years. And the gap in the lines represents that no matter how old you are, at least up until 68, we report having changed a whole lot more over the past decade than we anticipate changing in the future. In other words, like you look back at your former self and you think, I'm a pretty different person. I've grown over the past decade. I've learned something about myself. The story I would tell about who I am is different. But now I know who I am. Like I don't think I'm going to change anymore. Moving forward, I have a sense of my values, of my identity, of the relationships that matter to me. So, end of history illusion is called this because at any moment we feel like our personal history has ended. We know who we are and who we're going to be. But this is simply not the case. We just continue to change over the years. So I think this really shows us just how important it is to us to feel as if we've got a knowable and certain and predictable sense of who we are. Even though we change throughout the course of our lives, we don't really want to admit or acknowledge that we might be a different person in the future than we feel we are today. Okay, so believing that life is meaningful, very strong psychological need. That sense of meaning requires us to think about who we are, and not just who we are now, but who we have been in the past and who we will be in the future. Point 3 here is that this sense of who we are, the story we tell about our identity, it's social. It depends to a large extent on our relationships with others, the groups that we belong to. The sense of meaning that we experience when telling our life story, when constructing our identity, comes from the sense of belonging and connection that we feel to other people. This is a big part, and researchers think it's the most important part of our identity and the source of the meaning that we get in life. Other people, our relationships to them, the consequences our actions have on them, to what extent they value us. And there are a lot of studies that suggest this is the case. I'll just briefly describe a couple. When you ask participants, to what extent do you feel like you belong in the communities around you? To what extent do you feel valued by your community members? To what extent do you value the members of your community? The more belongingness you feel, the more meaningful you will say your life is. There is a very strong connection between your closeness to your group and how much meaning you say there is in your life. Second piece of evidence here, when we feel as if our belongingness is threatened, when we feel isolated, when we feel alone, when we feel disconnected from our communities, that is when we feel that our lives have the least meaning. When the things that we do have the least consequence for other people. So in this study, they measure how excluded people feel from their social groups. And they ask them then a variety of questions that are meant to measure how much meaning they feel in their lives. And the more excluded you feel, the more disconnected you feel, the less meaning you perceive. A lot of bad things happen when you feel disconnected from the groups that you value. So in this study, they also find that feeling socially excluded distorts your sense of time. It confuses you about how much time has passed. It increases lethargy. Right? Your body goes into sort of a defensive state, almost shuts down physiologically. You have compromised emotional responses. You don't feel the highs and the low, even the lows. You have sort of an emotional numbing. And finally, a lack of self-awareness, too. Your sense of who you are is compromised whenever you feel like you are being excluded from the groups that you value. Okay, so meaning in life, very important. Meaning is wrapped up with identity. Identity is social. It requires this sense of belonging. Final point. This is the one we'll spend most time on. We protect our identities and therefore a sense of meaning by defending the legitimacy of our social groups. Because our sense of meaning is wrapped up with our identity and our identity is social, the way that we maintain our sense of a meaningful life is by protecting that social identity, protecting our groups, defending them against threats. When we're confronted with differences, people that value other things, people that believe different things, we react defensively against them. Okay, so I'll show you a little bit of evidence for this point as well. This comes from research by a law professor, Dan Kahan, at Yale Law School, who also dabbles in psychology every now and then. He came up with this concept called identity protective cognition. In other words, that the way that we think, the way that we process information is all about trying to defend the beliefs of our groups. It's not that our brain is a truth seeker It's not that the way we process information is to find out what's right or what's wrong, what's true or what's false. Instead, the brain is wired to defend our identity. And whatever means we can use to accomplish that, we will deploy. So, to demonstrate this point, what Kahan does is he presents people with issues that are highly relevant to their identities. Now, he often conducts studies looking at political identity, so he'll present participants with issues that are relevant to their identities as liberals or as conservatives. But the theory applies to any aspect of our identity. Any kind of group that we affiliate with that has ideas or beliefs associated with it applies here. So I'll briefly describe some of his research. So in this study, what Kahan would do is he would present participants with scientists who are described as experts, in this case, in climate change. So these are climate scientists who have expertise in the issue of climate change. And he would give participants the scientist's credentials. It says here that this person is a professor of meteorology at MIT, got their PhD at Harvard, members of the American Meteorological Society and the National Academy of Sciences. So, credentialed up. If you were to generate an example of someone who probably has expertise on the subject, this would be the kind of profile you would imagine. So everyone sees this expert. Then they're told some information about what this expert believes. In one case, they're told that this expert believes, quote, "It is now beyond reasonable scientific dispute that human activity is causing global warming and other dangerous forms of climate change." So this is called the high-risk belief. Now, this is the belief that aligns with liberal ideology, according to Kahan. Other people are shown this expert who has the low-risk belief, and this is what that entails, quote, "Judged by conventional scientific standards, it is premature to conclude that human CO2 emissions, so-called greenhouse gases, cause global warming." Okay, so people in this study see one of these two kinds of beliefs, and then they're just asked to rate the expertise of the scientist. Not whether you agree with the conclusions, just, is this person an expert on the topic? And what you find is a very strong partisan difference in judgments of expertise. If you identify as very liberal or a strong Democrat, then you consider the scientist who says that global warming is an extremely high risk to be the expert. And you consider the scientist who says that it's premature to conclude, you consider that person to have less expertise. And the opposite is true for people who identify as very conservative or strongly Republican. Our judgments about who has expertise aren't driven by the credentials of, in this case, the scientist. They're driven entirely by whether or not the person's beliefs agree with our own. And it doesn't matter if you're a liberal, it doesn't matter if you're a conservative. You will believe the person whose beliefs confirm your existing ones. So if you've heard of confirmation bias, that's what's happening here. We've got our own beliefs, our pre-existing beliefs, And when we look out at the world, we process information in a way that confirms our existing beliefs. Okay. So this is the kind of study that Kahan will conduct. Gets people who vary in their group identities. Again, most of the time it's liberals and conservatives. Presents them with issues that have to do with those identities, and then asks them a variety of questions about their attitudes in those domains. And he always finds the same thing. People will process information in a way that protects their group. If I'm a liberal and you tell me something that aligns with liberal ideology, I think you're an expert. I think you're someone to be trusted, and I will believe you. And vice versa. If I identify as a conservative, and you present me with someone who espouses a conservative belief, that person's an expert, that person's to be trusted, I believe them. That just looks like a mess. So the key thing here is that the issue in question has to be related to the identity. So climate change, that's a political issue, at least now. Didn't used to be, but now it is. So when you present people with evidence that has to do with climate, now they're going to be motivated to protect their identities and interpret that evidence in a way that aligns and confirms with their groups. But there are lots of issues out there that aren't related to our identities. For example, in this mess of color here, there's a little graph that says artificial food colorings. Artificial food colorings is not an issue that has anything to do with politics, I don't think. Not yet. So when you ask liberals and conservatives to evaluate scientists who start giving you evidence about the risks of artificial food colorings, everybody agrees. If you show me a scientist who's got a PhD in, I don't even know what the relevant PhD would be, but something related to chemistry and toxins, and they're telling me that there's a risk of artificial food colorings. Let's say it's a potential carcinogen. Liberals and conservatives will agree on the quality of the evidence and whether or not to trust the expert, because it has nothing to do with their identities as liberals or conservatives. But the second that topic becomes relevant to their identities, now you're going to get the bias. If tomorrow Joe Biden gives a speech about the risks of artificial food coloring, then the next day, liberals and conservatives across the country are going to have politicized beliefs about artificial food coloring. And you can see this having unfolded in a lot of different ways already, right? I mentioned that 30 years ago, climate science wasn't a politically relevant issue. Liberals and conservatives had massively overlapping beliefs about, for example, the importance of fixing the ozone layer. COVID was an issue that didn't have to be politicized. Virology isn't something that had anything to do with liberal or conservative ideology until a leader of a political party made it so. And then everyone's got politicized, biased beliefs about vaccines and masks, et cetera, et cetera. So again, the idea here is that it's the connection between an issue and our identity that creates a situation where we're motivated to defend and protect our viewpoints. Now, one thing you might think is all we need to do is get smarter about evidence and issues, and if we can just become more educated or enlightened about issues, then perhaps this sort of bias, this tendency to defend our identities and protect them against threats, would go away. That's not the case. In fact, intelligence doesn't protect us from bias. It tends to actually inflame it. And the reason is because all humans, again, are motivated to protect their identities, protect the groups to which they belong. Your intelligence is a tool that you can use to do that. The better that tool, the more effective that tool, the better able you're going to be at defending your existing position, at defending your group. So what Kahan shows, this is again more evidence from his research, is that when you give people measures of either IQ or their scientific intelligence or their critical thinking skills, the magnitude of their bias, the magnitude of the difference between how, say, liberals and conservatives evaluate evidence, gets bigger as intelligence increases. So a big common response to, say, misinformation is to think we just need to educate people. That is not the solution. Unfortunately, as a professor, it pains me, but that is not the solution. It's to address the underlying motivation to interpret any kind of information in our environment in a way that protects our identities. That's what you have to get at if you want to address difference. Okay. So here's a quote from one of Kahan's papers that I think does a nice job of getting close to understanding just how important it is to evaluate information in a biased way to protect your group identities. So he writes, because issues have come to signify membership in and loyalty to identity-defining affinity groups, the stances people take on these issues can be very consequential for their social status. If a person's view is contrary to his or her groups, he or she faces the prospect of losing all manner of peer support, psychic and material. Accordingly, we should expect individuals to use all the cognitive resources at their disposal to form and persist in identity-consistent beliefs. In other words, what's at stake for a person when they are confronted with difference isn't just the truth. It's their sense of belonging to the communities that they value. And from an individual perspective, it makes more sense for me, in my own well-being, to privilege my group membership, the feelings of belongingness that I get from my groups, above and beyond being right or finding out what's true. If I identify as conservative, and you come to me with some evidence about human-caused climate change, and now I'm faced with the choice of either, maybe critically evaluating my position and thinking differently than I did before, while alienating myself from the people that I love, I'm going to go with maybe just sticking with the people that I love. It is not worth it to me, psychologically, to change my view on climate science while simultaneously severing myself from the communities that I value and that value me. That is not a good trade. So Kahan's point here is to say, it's rational for people to do this. It makes sense for every individual to prioritize their belongingness needs above figuring out what's true or false. So when we engage in this kind of bias, when we approach difference with skepticism and perhaps even like revulsion, Kahan says, that's the brain doing its thing. That's the brain doing what it should do if your goal is to have well-being. So, these differences in any kind of issue that has to do with our identity, they engage our motives to belong. They get us worried about who's on our team, who's on their team. They get us thinking about making sure we're protecting our belongingness goals. They threaten our sense of self, and they challenge the meaning that we get from the stories we tell about our life's purpose. When I am confronted with difference, what I'm being confronted with is a challenge to my identity. It's a challenge to the communities that I value and my sense of myself as a person who's living a meaningful life. That's a lot at stake when you confront someone with difference. And it's hard to expect them to respond to you with realization and persuadability and open-mindedness. That's a hard ask. Differences, they challenge our understanding of ourselves as living purposeful, significant, and coherent lives. And psychologists have terms for what happens when this understanding of ourselves as living a meaningful life starts to go away. They call it the deconstructed state or the disintegrated state. You lose entirely a sense of who you are, and it's comparable to a severe psychological trauma. This is almost the definition of psychological trauma. This is what happens when people are kept in solitary confinement for years. They lose all sense of who they are. This is, on a smaller scale than that, this is what is asked of us when we're presented with differences that challenge our identities. You're expecting others to abandon the identities that are central to them feeling like their life has meaning. Okay. So, again, we want meaning. We need it. Meaning is wrapped up with our identity, the sense of who we are. The sense of who we are comes from other people, comes from the groups that we belong. And because of that, when you threaten the groups that I belong to with your different ideas, now I'm motivated to protect my identity. And what's at stake isn't just who's right and who's wrong, what's true and what's not. It is my entire sense of myself as living a meaningful life. So just to put this to relate it to some of the themes that I was hearing before about Christian nationalism, when we think about groups that on their face seem to be motivated, and are to some extent, but seem to be solely motivated by things like fear, malice, ignorance, hatred. It's not just that. They're also motivated by the kinds of psychological needs that we all have. A need to belong to other groups, a need to feel valued, a need to see ourselves as people who are living meaningful lives filled with purpose, significance, and coherence. And at least from a psychological perspective, this is the deeper stuff. The fear, the hatred, that stuff is a result of this. And to get to the root of problems, to engage productively across differences, this is the kind of stuff that would be most beneficial to address. Now, not easy to address, but most beneficial. Okay, one other point that I want to make here. Despite the way that our brains are wired to protect our identities, to protect our sense of our lives as meaningful and coherent, we have something called the illusion of objectivity. The often mistaken belief that we see the world the way it actually is. Psychologists also call this naive realism. It's the bias that prevents us from recognizing our own bias. And there are a couple of defining features about this illusion of objectivity. First, that our beliefs, our feelings, our preferences, our tastes, our priorities, our values, they are realistic and objective. Second, other reasonable people should and will share them. If I see the world the way that it is, then all reasonable people will agree with me. Third, we can persuade those who disagree if we just find a way to show them the light. If they just open up their minds to reality, then they are persuadable. If they are not, if they cannot be persuaded, they are either ignorant or they're malicious. They're not good faith actors. That's the illusion of objectivity. And again, this is something that applies across all human beings. We don't want to accept the possibility that we don't see the world the way that it is. That challenges our sense of coherence. It's uncomfortable to think you live in a world that you can't understand, explain, or predict. So despite the evidence that suggests we are very biased in the way that we think about and process information, we can't see it in ourselves. It is hard to see it in ourselves. We experience the world in a way that tricks us into thinking that our perception brings clarity as opposed to distortion. Right? Our subjective experience is that the lens through which we see the world sharpens it as opposed to blurs it. But that is not what the psychological research suggests. The second you have beliefs, existing beliefs, the second you have identities that you want to protect, your subjective experience of the world becomes distorted. You look out at the world and you process information in a way that confirms your beliefs and that affirms your identities. So in all my classes where I teach about biases and group identities, I always want to drive home two ideas, two ways of looking at the world that I think hopefully kind of push back against some of the biases that I just introduced. First, before you can engage across differences, before you can reasonably expect to solve any kind of meaningful intergroup phenomenon, you need to understand the limits of your own subjective experience. You need to understand that this illusion of objectivity is an illusion. Nobody sees the world the way that it is. We all have our own unique psychology that filters and distorts it. And then second, understanding others' subjective experience, understanding that while I might not have access to reality, and you might not have access to reality, we both probably have something of use and value to contribute. And I think that the values that these two ideas connect to are humility, right? That's understanding the limits of your own experience, right? That you don't understand everything. And then empathy, trying to put yourself into the head of others, understanding how they feel, understanding that their beliefs might be on to something that yours are not. Those are the two character traits that at least I try to imbue in my students, in my classes when I talk about this sort of thing. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say. Thank you for having me here today. I'm happy to take any questions.
An opportunity for slightly bent questions. So Anne has a bias. She's not seeing time the way the rest of us are. And her way is correct. We'll take 3 questions, if there are. Here's one.
I think this is really helpful for, a sense of humility in approaching to the work. There's just a couple things that I'm curious about is because identity does shift, somehow that happens. Like our identity and our understanding of ourselves can change and does change. How does that happen when we're so kind of solidly in our lane? And one thing that I do want to challenge a little bit is that, if we put it in kind of the absurdist ultimate thing, you could have 2 experiences of something like a slave owner and a slave. Are their perspectives equally valid if you take this to its obvious extreme? That's the most extreme example, but it does bring into the question of power and the question, kind of into the political realm about what does control mean? What does political action involve? What are the implications of this for political action, especially for those of us who, with often a lack of humility, believe in a road towards justice or an arc towards justice? But how do we continue to do that work if we begin to believe that everything is kind of subjectively equal?
Yeah. So on the first question, how does identity change, or what happens when identity changes? First of all, identity certainly changes, right? As that end of history illusion idea suggests, people will report that they have changed significantly over the years. Now, there are probably some aspects of identity that are less malleable than others, but what this theory would predict is that as your identity changes, you form new motivations to protect whatever groups you now belong to, right? And I'm sure we can, we all know people who have gone through different phases of their lives when they affiliated with different either political identities or social identities or religious identities. And you could probably see in those people how their motivations to defend the particular ideologies that they were embedded in at that moment changed over time too. So it's not that people don't change. People do change. But when they change, now they're defending that particular system.
And somehow they lost the impulse to defend their former identity.
Absolutely right.
And that's, I think, what's really interesting is that
Yep.
we can be persuaded to lose a former identity. Sorry.
Yeah. No. Yeah. The only thing I would say there is that the way identity changes isn't necessarily, or I think usually, through persuasion. If we agree that what our identities are doing for us is satisfying that need to belong, just making us feel like we're a part of something valuable, then that's what changes. It's not that you've convinced me that my previous group's beliefs were wrong. It's that now my feeling of belonging is being satisfied better by this other group. And that suggests a different avenue towards persuasion, right? It's not me coming at you with ideas. It's me coming at you with a feeling of belonging, right? An attachment, a connection that you are now satisfying through some other means, but that now I can offer to you to give you a choice. Now, the second point about sort of the validity of these different experiences. So I try hard not to say anything, not to be prescriptive, not to say what kinds of beliefs are right and what kinds of beliefs are wrong. I obviously have opinions about what kinds of beliefs are right and wrong. But, so, you know, when it comes to the perspective of the slave owner and the perspective of the slave, these are not, in my opinion, equally valid views of the world. One is a lot less valid than the other. And the same is true for climate science or any other kind of politically relevant issue. I have political beliefs. But the point here is to, I think, these findings help you achieve your goals, whatever those goals may be, right? If your goal is to persuade someone of a different political persuasion or belief system to agree with you, what this research suggests is that you don't come at them with evidence. It's not about the content of their beliefs. You have to understand that the way they are experiencing the world and the way they are constructing their beliefs doesn't come from some kind of lack of knowledge or some kind of malice or ignorance or evil motivation. That's the value, right? So by no means do I want anyone to get the impression that I'm saying all beliefs are created equal. Completely not true in my opinion. But if we have goals, right, to change people's hearts and minds, then we need to understand the origin of their psychology. That's the way that we can craft interventions, whatever our goals might be.
Very good. That was substantive, so we will move on. And Scott?
Thanks for coming. We continue our weekend tomorrow morning up in that very high pulpit at our 10 o'clock service. Paul will be preaching, and he has a very interesting sermon title, which I will tell you more about tomorrow when I reintroduce him. So thanks again for coming, and we hope to see you tomorrow.
Thanks again, Piercarlo.